Hello and thanks for joining us for France in Focus. This week we're examining the rather sombre issue of death, which brings us to Père Lachaise, a cemetery known right across the globe because this is the final resting place of some of the great names in French literature, music and philosophy. In fact, it's not just the great and the good of France that are buried here. This is also the resting place of the likes of the Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde, the Polish composer Chopin, and the American rock star Jim Morrison. We're going to start, as usual, by taking a closer look at a few facts and figures.
Life expectancy in France is on a constant rise. In other words, the French are passing away later. Men at 79.5 years of age, women at 85.4 years old. On average, that's 16 years later than in 1950. But dying at an older age doesn't mean fewer deaths, quite the opposite. Between 2010 and 2017, the number of deaths in France jumped from 551,000 to 606,000. And that figure is expected to rise further. The reason for this trend? Baby boomers, that bumper generation born in the 20 years after World War II, is slowly growing old. So that change in demographic raises a practical question: how and where to bury the dearly departed? In France, as in many other countries, cemeteries in big cities are overcrowded. Paris, in particular, has a shortage of space. In 2017, almost all of the 3,150 deceased who were buried within city walls already owned a family plot in one of Paris's 14 cemeteries. Only 171 new plots were awarded in the capital. That left 5,000 requests unanswered. The other alternative is cremation. While not a lot cheaper, it is viewed as the environmentally friendly option. According to a survey conducted for the city of Paris in 2018, 63% of French people now prefer cremation to a burial.
This cemetery, like many others in city centres around France, is rather full. And partly for that reason, cremation has been, for a number of decades, the preferred choice for the majority of French people. And today, around 2/3 of people are cremated. Well, this cemetery, Père Lachaise, is home to the oldest crematorium in the country, dating back to the end of the 19th century. Well, to talk to us more about this and other issues associated with the subject, we're joined now by anthropologist Ellen Schwingelstein. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Ellen. You work for the Paris Funeral Services Foundation. I want to ask you, first of all, why it is that fewer and fewer French people are opting to be buried when they die.
C'est une question à laquelle il est difficile de répondre de façon catégorique.
It's hard to answer that question in any categorical way. There are clearly many reasons behind such a decision. And I'd say it's not so much that there are fewer burials, more the fact that for 4 decades now in France, the number of cremations has been on the rise. A trend that has stabilized recently, but it remains significant. So why? Well, perhaps we could surmise that there's been a real evolution in the way the French relate to religion. Perhaps there are also more practical reasons, like urbanization and the difficulty in finding available burial plots in certain areas. But it's certainly a reality we've had to adapt to at the Paris Funeral Service. We work to follow such societal changes and come up with the relevant tools to give families what they want.
It used to be the case that people with more money opted to be buried, people with less money opted to be cremated. Is that still the case?
No, you really can't make that simplistic distinction nowadays. First, because it doesn't add up financially. I mean, a burial and a cremation can cost pretty much the same thing. And it's not a class issue. Obviously, a preference for one or the other can be associated to religious practices. But then, social categories don't come into it either. I really don't think you can make any kind of generalization regarding either type of funeral arrangement.
It's increasingly the case here in France that there are secular wedding ceremonies, secular naming ceremonies for babies when they're born. Is it also the case for funeral ceremonies?
Absolutely. Secular funeral ceremonies are very much a growing trend. In fact, here at the Père Lachaise cemetery, over 2/3 of funerals are civil ceremonies. In other words, events that are not presided over by a religious official. As a result, my colleagues and I at the Paris funeral service have had to come up with a suitable form of secular ritual.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Hélène Zwingelstein, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, we're now at one of the largest monuments here at Père-Lachaise. It's a monument dedicated to the dead in general. And it was inaugurated back in 1899 on All Saints' Day. That's a day which is followed by the Day of the Dead, or the Festival of the Dead. Let's take a closer look at how that event is marked here in France.
It's a tradition that goes back centuries. Every year in early November, the French flock to cemeteries to commemorate their dead. The day is known as La Toussaint, or All Saints' Day.
I hope that our children will do the same for us. We carry on the tradition.
For us, it's sacred. We've always done this. That's how we were brought up.
La Toussaint is usually celebrated by placing flowers or candles on the graves of deceased loved ones. It's also an opportunity for members of a family, old and young, to come together. It's the same across the country, although there are regional differences. Here in the south of France, honouring the dead can be quite an adventure.
All of a sudden, you see a patch of vegetation and you think, oh, maybe it's a cemetery. Then you get closer, and it is a cemetery.
Many Protestant cemeteries like this one were built in secret locations. This after King Louis XIV banned Protestants in the 17th century and prevented them from burying their dead in Catholic cemeteries.
My father, Roger, is buried here with my mother. My grandparents are just behind.
Some graves are barely visible through the dense foliage, and it takes a chainsaw to clear them up ahead of the Toussaint celebrations. In Normandy, this cemetery too looks like it's frozen in time. Its 19th century tombs are covered with moss. Hardly anyone comes to pay tribute to the dead except for a few tourists.
Nature continues to put flowers on these graves.
Thousands of kilometres across the Atlantic in the French Antilles, dozens are busy dusting and polishing graves to make money.
People don't have time to look after these tombs, so we do it for them. We earn around 200 euros a day.
Here, Toussaint celebrations are a serious matter. Families usually get together for a night vigil, mixing animist and Christian traditions. Candles are lit to guide the souls of deceased loved ones. Some, however, take liberties with tradition.
You may have noticed that we don't pray much. We talk to each other. We gossip all day. We're here to chat.
Bringing together the living and sometimes the dead, that's what La Toussaint is all about.
Well, millions of people come to Père-Lachaise every single year. Some of them come here to see the tomb of someone they admire. Others come because it's a tranquil place and it's a nice way to escape from the hurly-burly of central Paris. Well, to tell us more about this place, I'm joined now by Régis Dufour-Forestier, who is from the Friends of Père-Lachaise Association. Thank you very much for talking to us. We're standing now in front of a tomb, which some people describe as the tomb of France's equivalent of Romeo and Juliet. Could you tell us a bit more about them?
Abelard was a professor of theology, and he was one of the most respected intellectuals of his time. People would come from all over Europe to follow his teachings. One day he took it into his head to give private lessons to the niece of the canon of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and the canon agreed. So he started giving lessons to the girl, Héloïse, who was only 14 or 15 years old, still very young. And the lessons were indeed very private. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, who she named Astrolabe. As you can imagine, Canon Fulbert was not happy at all. So he sent a couple of henchmen to beat him up and teach him good manners. But the henchmen went a bit overboard, and the poor Abelard was emasculated.
So why was it then that they were buried here at Père-Lachaise centuries after they actually died?
It was decided in 1817 to make this cemetery more profitable. It was far from Paris, more than 3 kilometers from the city, and Parisians didn't want to be buried here. So the authorities launched what you might call a marketing campaign. They organized the transfer of the remains of several high-profile historical figures, including Abelard and Héloïse. The same thing was done for Molière and Jean de La Fontaine. The strategy worked. From around 250 graves in 1817, there were more than 38,000 in 1830 and more than 70,000 today.
OK, well, should we go and have a look at the tomb of Molière then?
OK.
OK, so we're now in front of the tomb of Molière, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a possibility that he's not even in this tomb.
Molière was buried at night in a remote corner of the cemetery because actors were not held in high esteem back then. But no one knew exactly where he was laid to rest. In 1792, the revolutionary government decided to recover his remains, but they didn't know where to look. They took whatever bones they could find and transferred them to Père-Lachaise, but no one can prove that Molière is indeed buried here. They took whatever bones they could find, they gave them to the caretaker, and in 1817, they transferred his remains and those of Jean de La Fontaine to Père-Lachaise. But no one can prove that Molière is indeed buried here.
I know there's some tombs here that are considered to be quite controversial.
Oscar Wilde is definitely the enfant terrible of Père-Lachaise. Until recently, women would still come to leave a lipstick kiss on his tomb. Another controversial figure is Victor Noir, a young journalist who was killed by the cousin of Emperor Napoleon III. It caused a huge public outcry and sparked mass protests. Even today, his tomb is somewhat controversial. He's depicted as a man lying dead on the floor with a very noticeable bulge in his trousers.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Régis Dufort-Forestier. Thank you very much indeed.
Merci à vous.
And thank you to you for watching. I'll see you again soon here on France 24.
I'm Sarah Morris and I'm France 24's correspondent in Madrid. I'll bring you the latest news on Spain and Portugal, 2 countries battling to leave behind years of austerity. Join me live and check out my reports on France 24 and France24.com.
Sarah Morris, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.